In the colonnade of the Stoa Poikile in Athens, late in the 3rd century before the Common Era, an old man named Cleanthes was teaching when one of his own students rose to contradict him on a question concerning the soul. The student was Chrysippus, sharp-tongued, formidable in argument, and by some accounts already privately convinced that the school's second head had grown intellectually slow. Cleanthes is reported by Diogenes Laertius to have answered him only thus, that the youth had a natural aptitude for the discovery of arguments, but lacked as yet the knowledge of when to refrain from making them. It is a small exchange, easily passed over, but in it, the whole question of how a philosophical community survives its own disagreements is contained. For Chrysippus would go on to become the 3rd head of the Stoa, and the man whose work is so foundational that the ancients said, without him, there would have been no Stoa at all. And yet he did not arrive at this position by agreeing with his teacher. He arrived at it, in part, by contradicting him, refining him, sometimes openly correcting him in writing while the older man still lived, and the school did not break. Let us reflect, then, on what kind of arrangement among thinking persons makes such a thing possible. Not the suppression of disagreement, which is the method of the tyrant and produces only silence dressed as consent. Not the celebration of disagreement for its own sake, which is the method of the sophist and produces only noise. Something else, something more difficult. The Stoic schools in their early generations practiced a discipline of productive disagreement, and it is this discipline that we will examine together. The principle, stated plainly, runs as follows. Among those who pursue wisdom in common, disagreement is not a defect of the community, but a function of it. Two adherents of the same school, sincerely committed to the same end, will at certain points read the evidence differently, weigh the arguments differently, and arrive at conclusions that contradict one another. This is not because one of them is unfaithful to the school. It is because the school is engaged in inquiry, and inquiry that has reached its terminus is no longer inquiry, but recitation. The Stoics held that the goal of human life is to live in accordance with nature, which is to say, in accordance with reason. But what reason demands, in any given case, is not always self-evident. It must be discovered, and the discovery proceeds, as Zeno and Cleanthes and Chrysippus knew, through dialogue, through the testing of propositions against one another, through the willingness of a younger man to say to his teacher, "Here, I think, you have erred." Diogenes Laertius, in the 7th book of his Lives of the Eminent Philosophers, preserves for us something of how the school operated. Chrysippus, we are told, wrote more than 700 books. Many of these books were dedicated to refining, correcting, and in some cases reversing positions that Cleanthes had held. And yet Chrysippus did not found a rival school. He remained a Stoic. He took up the leadership of the Stoa upon Cleanthes' death, and he carried the school forward, not by repudiating his predecessors, but by completing their work where he found it incomplete. Consider what this requires. It requires first that the disagreement be substantive, that it concern the matter at hand, and not the standing of the persons involved. It requires, second, that the disagreement be subordinated to a common end, namely, the apprehension of what is true. It requires, third, that the disputants understand themselves as servants of the inquiry, not as proprietors of their own positions. And it requires, fourth, a kind of restraint, a willingness on the part of the elder to hear correction without humiliation, and on the part of the younger to offer correction without contempt. The wise man, the Stoics held, is not the man who has never been wrong. The wise man is the man who, when shown that he is wrong, alters his view. Epictetus would later say, in the Discourses, that the philosopher's school is a physician's surgery, and that one does not leave the surgery in pleasure but in pain, because one had come in not whole. The pain of being corrected is, on this view, the very evidence that the correction has done its work. It is thus that the Stoa, in its first century, did not fragment. It refined itself, and the refining was conducted, in large measure, between Cleanthes and Chrysippus, the second and third heads of the school, men who disagreed about much and remained throughout members of a single intellectual house. To understand how this was possible, one must consider who these men were and what their circumstances were and what it cost them to do what they did. Cleanthes was not by birth or temperament the figure one would have expected to lead a philosophical school. He had come to Athens, the sources tell us, with very little. He had been a boxer in his youth, a man of physical labor, and when he attached himself to Zeno of Citium, the founder of the Stoa, he supported himself at night by drawing water from wells in the gardens of the city. This work was so meager and so visibly humble that he was brought before the Areopagus, the Athenian court, to explain how he sustained himself, since he appeared to have no visible means. He produced the gardener for whom he drew water, and a woman for whom he ground meal, as witnesses to his livelihood. The court, hearing this, is said to have offered him a sum of money in recognition. Zeno forbade him to accept it. This is the man who, after Zeno's death, became head of the school. He was already old. He had been a student for 19 years. He was, by the testimony of his contemporaries, slower in mind than Chrysippus would later prove to be, less inventive, less dexterous in argument, but he was patient. He was unshakable. He had absorbed Zeno's teaching not as a doctrine to be defended, but as a way of life to be lived, and when he came to lead the Stoa, he led it as a man who had spent decades drawing water in the dark. Cleanthes wrote the hymn to Zeus, which has come down to us, and in which he prays, in lines preserved by Stobaeus, that the god lead him willingly, since if he refused, he would follow nonetheless, as the wicked do. He had a religious imagination. He saw the cosmos as a single living and ordered thing, and the philosopher's task as the alignment of the individual mind with the order of the whole. This was Stoicism in its devotional form, the form it took before Chrysippus would refine it into the more rigorous, more architectural system that the later school would inherit. Chrysippus came from Soli, in Cilicia, a city on the southern coast of Asia Minor. He came to Athens as a young man, and at first, the sources tell us, he studied with the academics, the heirs of Plato, before turning to the Stoa. He had been trained in skeptical methods. He knew how to dismantle an argument. He knew perhaps better than any Stoic before him how a position must be defended against the most searching objections, because he had been on the other side of those objections in his youth. When he came to Cleanthes, he came as a man already formed in the art of philosophical combat, and he turned this art almost immediately upon his own teacher. There is an anecdote preserved in Diogenes Laertius in which Chrysippus is said to have remarked to Cleanthes that he wished only to be taught the doctrines of the school and would discover the proofs for himself. The remark is recorded in the ancient sources with some ambivalence. It can be read as arrogance. It can also be read as the statement of a man who understood that to be a philosopher is not merely to receive, but to construct. The two men worked together in Athens for many years. The school in this period was not the grand institution it would later become. It met in the Stoa Poikile, the painted colonnade in the Athenian Agora, from which it took its name. Lectures were given in the open air before the frescoes of the Trojan War and the Battle of Marathon. Students came and went. The audience would have included Athenians and foreigners, the curious and the committed, those who would stay for an hour and those who would stay for 19 years. Cleanthes lived, by the ancient accounts, to a very great age, perhaps as much as 99 years. He died, the sources say, by refusing food during an illness of the gums, having reasoned that since he had already traveled half the road to death, he would not turn back. This was a man of extraordinary endurance, who had drawn water in the dark for his living, who had outlived his teacher by some 30 years, and who had carried a school through a generation in which he was, by common acknowledgement, intellectually outmatched by his most prominent student. It is here that the question becomes interesting. How did such an arrangement endure? How did a man of slower mind keep the loyalty of a man of faster mind in a discipline whose whole concern is the exercise of mind? And how did the faster man, who could surely have founded his own school had he wished, choose instead to remain, to disagree from within, to refine rather than to replace? The sources do not give us a single answer, but they give us hints. They tell us that Cleanthes possessed something Chrysippus respected, and that this something was not intellectual speed, but a quality of bearing, a constancy, a refusal to be drawn into the small wars of vanity that consume so much of philosophical life. They tell us that Chrysippus, for all his sharpness, understood that the school was something larger than any single thinker, and that to break it for the sake of being correct on a particular point would be to win the argument and lose the inquiry. This is the discipline we must now examine. The discipline of disagreement within fidelity. The discipline of saying to one's teacher or one's colleague or one's friend, "You are mistaken in this," while continuing to say, "We are engaged in the same work." Let us look then at how this functioned in practice. The disagreements between Cleanthes and Chrysippus were not minor. They concerned, in some cases, foundational matters of Stoic physics and psychology. Cleanthes held one view of the soul's location and operation. Chrysippus held another, and the ancient sources record that Chrysippus, in his writings, set out the disagreement openly, attributing the older view to Cleanthes by name and arguing against it. This is worth pausing on. Chrysippus did not pretend that no disagreement existed. He did not advance his own position as though it had no rival within the school. He named his teacher, stated his teacher's position with what the ancient sources suggest was at least minimum fidelity, and then explained where and why he departed from it. This is, in the language of philosophical method, a form of charity. To name your interlocutor is to grant him standing. To state his position is to acknowledge that he has one. The contempt of the philosophical opponent, by contrast, is the contempt that refuses to name, that paraphrases unfairly that builds a straw man in order to set fire to it. The Stoic school, in its formative century, did not work this way. It worked by attribution, by direct engagement, by the recognition that the predecessor's argument, even when wrong, was the necessary ground upon which the successor's argument could stand. Chrysippus could correct Cleanthes only because Cleanthes had said something definite enough to be corrected. The error of the teacher, on this view, is itself a kind of gift to the student, since it gives the student something to engage with, something to refine, something to push against. There is a remark attributed to Chrysippus in the ancient sources to the effect that if he had not been a Stoic, he would have been a cynic. This is sometimes read as a statement of philosophical preference. It can also be read as a statement about character. The cynic is the figure who stands outside, who refuses the institution, who speaks against, rather than from within. Chrysippus, who could have been such a figure, chose instead to remain within the Stoa, to do his disagreeing on the inside, to subordinate his very considerable intellectual power to the project of a school that he had not founded and could not own. This is the practice we are examining, not the absence of disagreement, the location of disagreement. The Stoics did not silence the dissenter. They positioned the disagreement within a shared frame of inquiry where it could do its work. And the work it did was not to fracture the school, but to advance it. Consider what would have happened had Chrysippus chosen the other path. Had he founded his own school, perhaps the Chryssippian Stoa, perhaps something else entirely, the early Stoic tradition would have split into rival institutions, each defending its own version of the doctrine, each diminished by the loss of the other. The conversations that produced the later, mature Stoic system, the system that would eventually reach Seneca in Rome and Epictetus in Nicopolis and Marcus Aurelius on the Danube, would never have taken place because the disputants would have been speaking past one another from rival podiums rather than to one another from the same colonnade. The choice Chrysippus made was not the choice of a man who lacked confidence in his own views. He had every confidence. He wrote, by the ancient count, more than 700 works defending and elaborating his version of Stoic doctrine. The choice was, rather, the choice of a man who understood that confidence in one's views is compatible with loyalty to one's school, and that the two are not at war. Cleanthes, for his part, did not respond to correction as a wounded man. The sources do not record that he expelled Chrysippus, or denounced him, or wrote bitter polemics against his most able student. He continued to teach. He continued to lead the school. And when he died, the leadership passed to the very man who had corrected him most often, without scandal and without resistance. This too is worth pausing on. The older man, who knew himself to be less quick than the younger, did not cling to the leadership as though it were a possession. He did not attempt to install a more loyal successor, a less troublesome heir. He let the school pass to the man best qualified to lead it, even though that man had spent years pointing out where his teacher had been wrong. It is hard, in any generation, to do what Cleanthes did. The instinct of the corrected is not to elevate the corrector. The instinct is to defend, to retaliate, to find some ground on which the corrector can be diminished. Cleanthes appears not to have indulged this instinct. He had spent his life drawing water and grinding meal and listening to Zeno, and one supposes that such a life produces a certain kind of equanimity, a certain immunity to the small vanities that wreck philosophical communities. What, then, is the principle's structural lesson? What is being taught here beneath the historical detail? The lesson is this: a community of inquiry survives its disagreements only when its members understand themselves as servants of something larger than their own positions. The position is held in trust. It is held provisionally. It is held to be tested. And the testing is done by others, by those who do not share the position, who see what its holder cannot see, who can locate its weak points because they are not invested in defending them. In a community organized this way, the function of the dissenter is not opposition, but service. The dissenter serves the inquiry by pointing out where it has gone astray. The dissenter is not a threat to the community. The dissenter is a constitutive part of the community, without whom the community would calcify into a set of recited doctrines, defended by repetition rather than by argument. But this requires something of the community in turn. It requires that the community know how to receive correction. It requires that the elder, the established, the one in the position of authority, hold the authority lightly enough that correction does not feel like assault. It requires that the dissenter, in turn, offer the correction in a form that can be received, that is to say, with attribution, with charity, with the acknowledgement that the corrected position was held in good faith by a person of equal seriousness. The Stoics had a technical term, oikeiosis, sometimes translated as appropriation or affiliation, for the natural movement by which a creature recognizes what belongs to it and what is akin to it. The school itself, on this view, was an extended oikeiosis, a community of those who recognized one another as akin in the work of inquiry. Within such a community, the disagreements were not threats to the kinship. They were exercises of it. It is worth saying plainly what this principle does not mean. It does not mean that all disagreements are productive. It does not mean that the dissenter is always correct, or even that the dissenter is always operating in good faith. There are disagreements that fracture communities because they are not in fact disagreements about the matter, but disagreements about who shall be honored, who shall lead, who shall be heard. Such disagreements are not what we are describing. We are describing disagreements about the inquiry, conducted by persons who hold the inquiry to be more important than themselves. The wise man, the Stoics held, holds even his own views provisionally, ready to revise them upon better evidence. He does not identify with his positions as a miser identifies with his money. He holds them as a steward holds what has been entrusted to him, intending to return them improved if he can, and unimproved if he cannot, but never to claim them as his own private possession. Chrysippus, in his disagreement with Cleanthes, was doing the work of a steward. So was Cleanthes in his reception of the disagreement. The school survived because both men understood themselves this way. There is one further matter to consider before we close. The Stoic tradition we have inherited, the tradition of Seneca and Epictetus and Marcus, is not the work of a single mind. It is the deposit of a long argument, conducted over centuries among persons who often disagreed sharply with one another, but who recognized themselves throughout as engaged in a common labor. When Seneca writes to Lucilius and quotes Epicurus approvingly, He is participating in the same tradition. When Marcus writes in the Meditations that what is good for the swarm is good for the bee, he is articulating in his own words a principle that Cleanthes and Chrysippus had worked out in the Athenian Agora 4 centuries earlier. The tradition is alive because it has been argued. It is coherent because the arguments have been conducted in good faith by persons who held the inquiry above themselves. This is what we inherit when we open a Stoic text. We inherit not a doctrine, but a long conversation in which the dissenters were not expelled but incorporated, and in which the corrections were not suppressed but preserved. Let us now sit for a moment with what this asks of us. You may consider in your own life where you stand in relation to those with whom you share an inquiry, whatever inquiry that may be. Perhaps it is a household, perhaps it is a friendship, perhaps it is a body of professional colleagues, or a community of those who share some commitment, religious or political or intellectual. In any such community, there are disagreements. There are persons whose views diverge from your own. The question is not whether such disagreements exist. They will exist in any community of thinking persons by the simple fact that thinking persons do not all reach the same conclusions. The question is what you do with them, whether you hold them as threats to the community or as exercises of it, whether you receive correction as assault or as service, whether you offer correction as conquest or as gift. Cleanthes, drawing water in the dark, did not know that his slower mind would be remembered alongside the faster mind of Chrysippus. He could not have known. He simply did his work and let the school pass to the man best suited to lead it, and the tradition was preserved because of what he did not do as much as because of what he did. He did not cling. He did not retaliate. He did not insist that his own views be vindicated. And Chrysippus, who could have founded a school of his own, did not. He stayed. He disagreed from within. He named his teacher in his books and argued against his teacher's positions, while continuing, in every other respect, to be his teacher's student. The question I would leave with you is this: in the disagreements you carry with those whose work you share, are you positioned as a steward or as a proprietor? Do you hold your views as a man holds what has been entrusted to him, ready to return them improved or to surrender them if they cannot be improved? Or do you hold them as a man holds his money, fearing every approach as a thief's? The Stoics held that this question is not asked once and answered once. It is asked of us continually in every disagreement we enter, by the very structure of being a thinking creature in a community of other thinking creatures. Consider it then as you go. Consider where you have clung and where you have served. Consider whether the schools you belong to, in whatever sense you belong to schools, are the better for your dissent or the worse for your possessiveness. And consider finally whether the work of the inquiry, the work that Cleanthes and Chrysippus were engaged in together in the painted colonnade, is a work you are willing to subordinate yourself to, as they did. It is thus that the school endures, not by the absence of disagreement, but by the discipline of it. And it is thus, the Stoics would have said, that the soul is formed.